Canadians are quietly boycotting US brands, and it's working. Reuters, May 2025. Trump jokes Canada should just become the 51st state. Ottawa doesn't laugh. Financial Times, March 2025. At first, it seemed symbolic, but by summer, it had teeth. From ketchup to Cybertrucks, Canadians were walking away from American products. McDonald's foot traffic plunged, Jack Daniels disappeared from store shelves, and Amazon shuttered an entire distribution center. The US dismissed it as noise. Canada turned it into a movement. What happens when your closest ally decides it doesn't need you anymore? For decades, Canada and the United States shared one of the world's closest commercial relationships. Bound by geography and trade pacts like NAFTA and later CUSMA, Canadian households consumed everything from US-made cereals and jeans to smartphones and SUVs. In return, American businesses relied on Canada as a loyal customer, predictable, profitable, and culturally familiar. Shopping at Walmart, streaming on Netflix, sipping Starbucks on a snowy Montreal afternoon, these weren't political choices. They were just normal life. That era now feels distant. Tensions began to simmer in early 2025. As President Trump reinstated aggressive tariffs on Canadian goods and floated the idea of Canada as the 51st state, something shifted. It wasn't just policy. It was perceived as humiliation. At first, the backlash was subtle. A few op-eds here, a boycott hashtag there. But by spring, the response hardened. A nationwide Angus Reid survey found that 78% of Canadians intended to buy Canadian more deliberately, and 59% planned to avoid US products whenever possible. This wasn't government-led retaliation, it was personal. Grassroots apps like MapleScan and BuyBeaver exploded in popularity, helping shoppers identify Canadian-made goods. Liquor boards in Ontario, LCBO, and Quebec, SAQ, stopped selling American spirits. Restaurants quietly pulled Coca-Cola from menus. Supermarkets began tagging domestic brands with red maple leaf stickers. What emerged wasn't a formal boycott, but something more resilient, a cultural pivot. It was silent, it was civil, but it was sharp. And as American companies began to feel the sting, through canceled orders, inventory surpluses, and shrinking market share, Washington underestimated one key fact. Canadians don't yell, they just stop buying. The US action, tariffs, insults, and unintended consequences. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, trade was among his first targets. On February 2nd, he signed an executive order under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, reimposing 25% tariffs on nearly all Canadian imports, ranging from aluminum and dairy to electronics and pharmaceuticals. The stated reason, protecting American jobs from unfair Canadian dumping and currency manipulation. But the economic rationale was thin. Canadian trade surpluses with the US had narrowed, not widened. Analysts from Brookings and CIBC quickly labeled the move more symbolic than strategic. Still, Trump doubled down, telling supporters at a Pennsylvania rally that Canada ought to be grateful, and joking that maybe it's time they became our 51st state. The crowd laughed. Ottawa didn't. The impact was immediate. US exports to Canada dropped sharply as Canadian retailers, importers, and distributors scrambled to avoid sudden cost spikes. Yet the Trump administration seemed unbothered, believing American brands were indispensable to Canadian consumers. They were wrong. By March 2025, US retail giants began noticing irregularities in Canadian sales data. Walmart and Costco reported stagnant growth despite heavy promotions. McDonald's franchise owners in Toronto and Vancouver flagged a steady decline in lunchtime traffic, down 15 to 20% year over year. The administration dismissed it as market noise, but the signs piled up. Amazon executives confirmed that Prime cancellations in Quebec and Ontario had spiked 11%, while traffic to competing domestic platforms like Simon's and Well.ca surged. Even Tesla, a tech darling, reported a jump in Cybertruck order cancellations across Canada, especially in provinces with strong local manufacturing pride. But the real blind spot was cultural. To Trump, trade was a scoreboard. To many Canadians, it was now a question of sovereignty. The language used, mocking Canada's independence, pushed resentment beyond the policy level. It became a matter of identity. Brands like Nike, Oreo, and Netflix were now caught in the middle. Nike, already under scrutiny for labor practices, saw Canadian influencers call for rejection of foreign-made exploitation. Netflix, already under fire for content gatekeeping and cracking down on password sharing, became the symbolic villain of cultural erosion. And none of it was coordinated. There were no sanctions, no government-led embargoes, just consumers turning, one by one, away. By April, several U.S. manufacturing hubs began to feel the pressure. Heinz, whose ketchup factories in Ohio and Michigan once supplied heavily to Canada, saw a double-digit drop in bulk orders. This led to reduced shifts and short-term furloughs. Similarly, Jack Daniel's, which lost shelf space in LCBO and SAQ, reported excess inventory in Texas and Georgia, forcing temporary slowdowns in production. What Washington failed to recognize was that Canadian consumer power, though quieter than tariffs or protests, was just as potent, and it had been awakened. Canada's response, silent, strategic, and collective Canada, could have retaliated officially. Ottawa had the legal tools, but instead of counter-tariffs or WTO filings, the response came from the ground up. What made this boycott unique wasn't its volume, but its voluntarism. By mid-March, apps like MapleScan, BuyBeaver, and OScanada were topping the Canadian App Store charts. Designed to scan barcodes and flag American-made goods, they empowered shoppers to make informed choices without political rhetoric. Combined, these apps garnered over 1 million downloads within 3 months. Canadian supermarkets began redesigning shelf space to feature domestic alternatives. Red maple leaf labels marked locally produced ketchup, shoes, beverages, and electronics. Stores like Loblaws, Sobeys, and Canadian Tire embraced the shift, reporting that customers were actively requesting non-US options. At the LCBO in Ontario and SAQ in Quebec, American alcohol quietly disappeared. Bourbon was replaced with Canadian whiskey. Tennessee Rye was substituted with BC craft blends. The changes weren't advertised, but they were noticed, and the movement rippled. Fast food chains like McDonald's and Subway saw foot traffic fall by up to 30% in metro areas. Some franchisees began sourcing Canadian meats and potatoes to blunt the criticism, but many customers had already moved on to Tim Hortons, A&W, or local diners. Even in tech and entertainment, backlash brewed. Netflix, once dominant in Canada, faced rising cancellation rates amid criticisms over US-centric content, lack of French-language programming, and the password-sharing crackdown. Domestic competitors like Crave and CBC Gem gained subscribers. Canadian creators began promoting unsubscribe month campaigns, and they gained traction. Amazon, too, felt the chill. In July 2025, the company closed its Quebec distribution center, citing regional underperformance. That alone led to over 700 layoffs, a direct consequence of declining Prime subscriptions and reduced demand. Canada Post and Shopify-based retailers saw increased usage. The backlash even reached unexpected corners. Oreo, which had moved production to Mexico, saw sales drop in protest of offshoring. Nike, long dominant in Canadian sportswear, struggled to move inventory, especially after allegations of forced labor made headlines again. This wasn't economic decoupling overnight, but it was a serious shift in consumer behavior. Canadians were not demanding purity. They were demanding respect. For years, Canada had absorbed insults with politeness. But now, every bottle left on a shelf, every subscription canceled, was a quiet answer to the question, what happens when your neighbor mocks your sovereignty? The stalemate. No clear resolution, just accumulating damage. By late August 2025, Both governments were locked in a strange dance of denial. The Trump administration maintained that the tariffs were working. "The Canadian boycott is a joke," one White House aide told Politico. "They'll be back when they need our goods." But internal trade reports painted a different picture. U.S. exports to Canada had fallen nearly 14% in Q2, with disproportionate hits in retail, entertainment, and packaged foods. Canada, meanwhile, remained diplomatically silent. Officials in Ottawa refused to comment on consumer trends, even as they quietly encouraged domestic manufacturing stimulus programs and launched Buy Canadian media campaigns. Industry on both sides began to feel trapped. American companies lobbied the White House for exemptions or policy adjustments. Canadian distributors complained about lack of reliable U.S. parts and packaging materials. Some sectors tried to adapt, others shrank. What emerged was a cold economic war, not loud, not explosive, but persistent. Neither side would blink. Neither could retreat without losing face. But in the middle stood the everyday consumer, the laid-off worker, the small business owner, paying a price that no headline could capture. Impact on Canada. The collapse of cross-border retail in Windsor. For decades, Windsor, Ontario, thrived as a cross-border city. Its economy was deeply entangled with neighboring Detroit, relying on a constant flow of Americans crossing into Canada to fill prescriptions, visit casinos, or enjoy cheap meals, and on Canadians returning with full shopping bags from outlet malls across the border. But in 2025, things changed. As the Trump administration ramped up tariffs and anti-Canada rhetoric, Canadian sentiment hardened. A ripple of resentment turned into a retail reckoning. Travel to the U.S. from Canada dropped by more than 30%, according to Statistics Canada. That alone cost thousands of U.S. tourism and retail jobs, but it also hit Windsor's ecosystem in an unexpected way. Reverse traffic stopped too. Local retailers in Windsor that once specialized in reselling or servicing American brands, like Nike, Amazon-based returns, and U.S. tech accessories, saw demand collapse. An independent electronics repair shop, once busy with iPhones and Amazon Fire tablets, shuttered in June. "People just aren't buying American gear anymore," the owner told CBC, "and if they do, they won't fix it." Windsor's iconic LCBO location removed Jack Daniel's and Maker's Mark from its shelves. Local restaurants began advertising menus 100% U.S. product free. A once small gesture became a competitive advantage. Even the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel duty-free reported a 48% drop in U.S. goods sold to Canadian travelers, as domestic travelers turned inward, using platforms like Buy Beaver to track product origin. Culturally, the tone shifted. Maple flags adorned storefronts not on Canada Day, but year-round. And the pride wasn't aggressive, it was reflective. Buying Canadian had become less about protest and more about principle. Still, the dislocation had costs. Small distributors dependent on U.S. imports suffered. Some tried to pivot to EU or Asian suppliers, but logistics lagged behind sentiment. While Canadian nationalism surged, the transition left a trail of disruption in its wake. Blowback on the U.S., a supply chain squeeze in Cincinnati, Ohio, consumer goods manufacturing had long depended on one thing above all: Canadian demand. Factories producing sauces, cereals, snack foods, and cleaning supplies relied on predictable cross-border exports to balance volumes and stabilize costs. That balance shattered in spring 2025. At the heart of the city, a Heinz bottling facility that shipped ketchup and other condiments across North America began to experience order fluctuations. When LCBO and several Canadian grocery chains dropped U.S.-branded products in favor of domestic alternatives, the disruption wasn't dramatic, but it was sharp. Bulk orders dropped by 17% in April, forcing the facility to cut 2 shifts by June. Nearby, a contracted logistics firm servicing Heinz and Kraft laid off 90 drivers. Refrigerated trucks meant for Ontario were rerouted or sat idle for days, racking up warehousing fees and fuel costs. For consumers, prices didn't rise immediately, but factory workers noticed. It's not a political issue here. It's a paycheck issue, said one union representative. And it wasn't just ketchup. Nike distribution centers in Tennessee and Indiana, which supplied Canadian retailers with shoes and apparel, saw stockpiles mount. As Canadian chains shifted toward domestic or Asian-made alternatives, Nike was left with excess inventory and nowhere to send it. Temporary warehouse closures followed. Meanwhile, Netflix's Canadian user base shrank as Ottawa producers publicly urged cancellations and French-speaking subscribers balked at stagnant content. The result? Slashed marketing budgets, a freeze on Canadian content acquisition, and job cuts in regional offices. And then there was Amazon. Its warehouse closure in Quebec wasn't just a local story. It created shockwaves in American logistics. Reduced demand led to excess inventory across New York and Michigan, clogging fulfillment centers and triggering AI-driven price drops to clear shelves. Margins shrank. Performance bonuses vanished. Washington may have believed Canada's market was too small to matter, but for workers and businesses in places like Cincinnati, it mattered a great deal. The boycott wasn't loud, but it was layered, spreading slowly, until it suddenly hit the bottom line. The damage is now impossible to ignore. What started as a series of tariffs and offhand remarks has snowballed into a real economic break. Consumer habits altered, supply chains shaken, and jobs lost on both sides of the border. In Canada, buying local is no longer a trend. It's a quiet act of defiance. In the US, warehouses are full, shifts are cut, and brands once considered global staples are struggling to regain ground. The political divide has spilled into storefronts, checkout lines, and family dinner tables, and the question facing leaders, companies, and citizens is no longer hypothetical. It's here, in daily choices. In the race to define the future, will North America win together or lose everything trying to go it alone? You're American or Canadian? What's your take? Share your story and your view in the comments below.